Woo! Yeah, we got the air guitars. we got Dan bopping his head. He's hardcore head bopper, or low key head bopper. Sorry.
Yes. I don't ever get that excited.
There we go. Welcome everybody to another edition of the Ben and Ryan Show. We are just coming off of our live event, which is very exciting. So a little self-advertising. If you're watching this, stay tuned. Every month we do a Ben and Ryan open mic. So that is lots of fun. And this week we have joining us, of course, you have your favorite hosts. We have Ben Nadel.
Yo.
We're Ryan Brown right here. So I guess I'm the Jerry to his Ben and Jerry's ice cream. I mean, whatever the flavor of the week is, there we go.
Can I just say, when I was growing up, my parents lived on Cherry Garcia ice cream, which is named after Jerry Garcia. And as a kid, the idea of putting fruit into ice cream was like off-putting. I thought it was disgusting. I never tried it, and I tried it for the first time like a year ago. I was just like, oh, goddamn, this ice cream is so good.
Spent your entire life assuming that was horrible.
Oh, so many years missing out.
Yeah. Oh, now you just need to make up for it. Make sure you buy a new freezer. Stock it.
Deep freeze just for Ben and Jerry's.
That's right. You got time to catch up, man.
Well, Dan, welcome to the show and welcome to the world of tangents. I mean, we started off on a tangent that showcases the power of the Ben and Ryan tangents. So, Dan, welcome. He is director of engineering for Virtuous Software. So, can you give us like a 10-second elevator on Virtuous Software in case anyone is interested?
Yeah, we build CRM and related tools for nonprofits. So our goal is, the top line metric for our company is increasing global generosity. So it's our goal to support nonprofits, make sure they have the sophisticated tools that they need in order to engage with donors, and just get the most out of their platform and their fundraising efforts.
Awesome. Well, awesome. I mean, awesome message also there. So it's good to, and the name matches what your mission is. So
yeah, I enjoyed a lot.
One thing that I recently learned from Dan, and I don't know how broadly applicable this is, but I just thought it was an interesting tidbit. I'd want to share it here. I had thought that the way nonprofits operated was you give them some money and they do with it as they will. But as Dan was telling me, they actually have to attribute the money for a particular task. So let's say you want to donate money to open a new annex to a hospital. I'm just making stuff up here. And then they finish the annex, but they have money left over. They can't just willy-nilly reallocate it to another project. They actually have to go back to the people who donated and say, hey, we have money left over. Where would you like us to allocate it now? Which I had no idea.
Do you want us to put it? Do you want us to put it towards a new project, or do you want us to send it back to you? From a tax perspective, they have to spend the money in the way that the donor specifies that the money be spent. And so when you donate, you can either donate to a general fund, which in that case means that it can be used however the nonprofit chooses. Okay. But if I say I'm donating money for this project, and all of my money doesn't get used for that project, then they have to come back to me and say, okay, where would you like the rest of it allocated? Here's another project that you might be interested in, or we can refund it back to you. So yeah, there's a whole lot of rules around how money has to be allocated. It's not like Salesforce where you're just selling a widget to somebody and like, oh, well, you bought the widget, we're all good. I can just record the fact that you bought the widget. We got to track who the money came from, where the money went, how it gets spent, whose like pockets it goes into, who gets credit for it from a gift officer perspective. There's just a whole bunch of machinery behind the scenes to make sure that money is spent properly when you're donating it to a nonprofit.
Oh, interesting. So everybody, if you're listening, or for those listening, or our audience out there, we are not going to be talking about the CRM. We just wanted to know ahead of time.
No, you're not. Tangents.
The only off-topic, or like the only thing that's not allowed is staying on topic.
As we do every show, I just throw out all of the YouTube podcast principles of hooking the audience in the first 30 seconds, and we just got to run with whatever's on our mind. So
there you go.
If you're wondering the topic for the day, we're talking about management and career paths for developers, and is management for everybody, or what are other options out there, and what are our experiences? So we have varied experiences here today to kind of give some perspective and what we've learned from our time out there in the audience. So Dan, welcome for helping us to kind of dive into this. So can you give us a little, for the audience out there, so they kind of, those who don't know you, can you give us like a rundown of your career path and kind of how you got to where you are now?
Yeah, I joined the Army right out of high school as an administrative assistant. So basically managing paperwork for the military. And I found that they love paper and I do not. And so I found ways to automate my way out of problems, which led to me kind of learning Visual Basic for applications, doing applications in Microsoft Access and Excel when I was in the military. When I got out of the military, I got a job as an IT manager and continued to kind of automate myself out of one job after another, and started doing web development way back in the early days, 2000, 2001, when Dreamweaver and UltraDev and all those kind of tools were just coming out. And then I spent probably 8 or 9 years as an individual contributor, either doing freelance consulting. I worked for lynda.com. I worked for a company called land.com, and just building applications in Cold Fusion, and got to a point where as a member of a 5-person company, we grew to like 20 or 22 people, which meant we hired some more engineers. At that point, I started dipping my toes into the world of management around 2010. And from there, I spent 13 years at CoStar and land.com, kind of building that team from me to about 24 people. And then I worked at Envision for a little bit with Ben before Envision closed its doors. And then I joined Virtuous Software about 1.5 years ago as an engineering manager. And then last December, December 2023, got promoted to director there. And I basically oversee kind of people, process, projects. My job is to make sure that all the engineers are happy, healthy, and successful. They've got all the tools they need to do the work that they need to do. They're pushing code. They're getting things out to production. I haven't committed any production code in probably 5 years other than spelling mistakes in code comments. So I'm not a technical director any longer. I have another person that works alongside me who's deeply, deeply technical, another director of engineering at Virtuous. And he makes sure that everybody's building things the right way. And I try to make sure that everybody's building the right thing. And so we kind of split our responsibilities that way. And so, yeah, I was also a reluctant manager. We talked a little bit about that before the show. Just, we hired more engineers. You're in charge now, and just tried to figure out how to be a manager. So yeah, that's kind of the span of my career. I've gone from IC to team lead to manager, and I've kind of been doing that for 10, 12 years now.
So let's take a second and excuse me, and dive deeper into the reluctant manager piece. Because before the show, we were talking about how when you first started in management, at least, you still wanted that individual contributor. I mean, that was still in your heart.
Yeah.
And how did you make that transition?
Very slowly, with lots of existential angst. So when we hired the first couple engineers, generally what happens in very small companies is like, okay, so you were the first engineer, you're the lead technical talent on the team, so you're going to manage the engineers. That can take 2 different forms. It can be technical lead, where you're just helping people write good code, you're doing pull requests, you're taking care of all that kind of stuff. It can also be people lead. You're going to approve their PTO. You're going to have performance conversations. You're going to search out and hire new engineers. So when I first took over, I didn't really want to be a manager. So I thought I was just going to be the head engineer writing code and kind of helping everybody else write code. Mm-hmm. And it turned into a role where I was doing far more people management than I was frankly prepared for as a young engineer. And so I probably spent 2-3 years fighting against that in my head, because from a management perspective, you have to find your wins in different ways than you do as an individual contributor. As an individual contributor, I can commit some code. I can see it pass all the tests. I can see all the lights turn green. I can push it to production. I can see people using it, and I can get some measure of satisfaction from doing that. As a manager, I don't push code anymore. So how do I find my wins? I have to find those through making sure that I help people solve their problems, that I'm involved in conversations and making sure that leadership understands what the team is doing. And it just took me a really long time to figure that out, that I need to search out my wins and feel good about the work that I'm doing in a different way than I used to. Because as an IC, it's oftentimes really, really easy to see your wins. I committed some code. It went through the CI/CD pipeline. It showed up in production. That's a win. I can't go home at the end of the day and say, "Hey, Dad, look what I made," when I'm a manager. I can't. I have to have like a 30-minute conversation with my wife about, "Hey, I helped somebody work through a hard personal problem at work today, and here's all the context around that, and here's how hard it was." And like, but I can't just go, "Hey, look, I made this thing." That's not how management works anymore. And so you have to kind of figure out how you can enjoy that process.
So it's interesting. In your current role, you mentioned that you have another person at Virtuous who does the technical lead piece of it, or chief whatever the title they're giving for the head person in charge of the technical piece. What made you not go towards that direction? Because you said it took 2-3 years. I'm sure in your head you're like, okay, do I make the switch, or do I stick with being
Good question.
the person who does the chief architect?
Honestly, it's because it's what my team needed. We were in a very small group. When I first started moving to full-time management responsibilities, I think we had 5 or 6 other engineers at the company at that time. And so we had to have somebody who could push back against product in a productive way. We had to have somebody who could advocate for the engineers. We had to have somebody who could help them figure out where they weren't performing how they needed to. We needed someone to help shepherd them through their career transitions. Like, what do you want to be when you grow up? That type of conversation. We didn't have anybody else to do that, but I was the only one available. And so I just kind of stepped into that role. I didn't even realize there was the possibility of another way of doing it until we got much larger. And frankly, when I left CoStar and started at Envision, and Envision had a completely different way of managing things. I worked at one company for 13 years, and I started there when there were just 5 of us. And so I made it all up as I went along. I had nobody to kind of shepherd me through the process and go, here's what a manager does, or here's the type of manager you could be. I just had to kind of make it up as I went along, because I was always at the front of the pack. And so I didn't have a mentor to kind of shepherd me through that process. And frankly, one of the reasons I left CoStar is I wasn't getting the type of management experience that I felt I wanted in order to grow better. I was kind of stuck. And so I'm like, I need to find some other way to do this. One was the pandemic and kind of return to office policies, that I've been working remote for years and didn't want to go back to an office, but I also wasn't getting the career opportunities that I wanted in order to have broader responsibility. And so it's always a challenge trying to figure out where you're going to go next.
Let me ask a question about that then, because I think there are probably engineers listening to this who are interested in trying out the management track, but there's 2 ways to do it. There's either grow into management at the company you're currently at, or jump to a new company and take on a management role. And it sounds like, I mean, you're talking about sort of making it up as you go, but I feel like that's how a lot of us get through our careers, is we're just sort of making up as we go, and we're getting experience under our belt. So is the recommended path, do you think, to grow into management at the current company so that expectations about management, about your experience, are all sort of level set?
So there's a bit of a double-edged sword, right? If you are growing within your current company, then you know the lay of the land, right? You know how things work. I think it's probably a little bit easier to slide into that kind of management role, but you also run the risk of constantly being pulled back into that individual contributor responsibility, which is partly where a lot of my frustration was early as a manager, because I'm expected to be a manager, but Dan, you can fix this faster than everybody else. We need you to get in and fix this production issue. We need you to get in and help us fix this particular problem. And so not only did I want to do that kind of work, but I was constantly being asked to do that type of work when that was no longer my responsibility as far as my job title was concerned. And so honestly, when I left CoStar and I started at Envision, CoStar was, Land.com was all Cold Fusion. At least the core parts of it that we were still using, which means I was kind of still the technical expert on all that stuff. And when I went to Envision, I haven't touched a line of production code since, because at Envision, I didn't know Node. I didn't know React. I didn't know any of the tools that we were using there. And so I could not be an individual contributor, which allowed me the freedom to focus on the management side of my responsibilities. And it's the same thing at Virtuous. Everything is C# and .NET. I wrote a few lines of .NET back in like 2002 before I broke down in tears and said, "Screw it, I'm going back to Cold Fusion." And that was
We need
early,
to
early
isolate
days.
that quote right there from Dan is like, all right, I broke down in tears in C#, so went back to Cold Fusion.
.NET 1 was bad for the web. And so when I've never, and I tell engineers when I'm having hiring conversations during the interview process, this isn't going to be a technical interview because I've never written a line of C#. I can't do what you do. And so we're going to have a conversation about how you like to work, the type of problems that you like to solve, how you want to grow your career. We're going to talk about things that don't involve code. But that transition from one company where I had been the technical expert for a decade to another company where I knew nothing about the technical landscape kind of freed me up to focus on being a manager, being a director, having a broader sense of responsibility around the direction that the team takes. If I had moved into a company where I could jump in and like start knocking out code quick, it would have been a little bit more difficult for me to kind of focus on just being a manager. And so I think to answer your question, Ben, it kind of depends on what the support of your current management structure is in your current organization. If you can trust that they're not going to constantly pull you back to fix things you wrote 2 months ago before you took on that management responsibility, and you can leave it to your team, I think that's probably an easier management transition because you know everybody, you know the processes, you know how everything works. You go into a new place, oftentimes coming in as a new manager for an existing team, it can be a little bit dicey, especially if you're replacing a manager and not just coming in as a brand new role, because they have an expectation of how the last guy ran things, and you have to come in and kind of set up expectations for how you're going to run things, and it can be a little bit tricky.
I'll add to that. I think that if you're new into management, jumping into a new company, you're not going to have the same runway. They're not going to give you, okay, hey, we're going to give you time to figure it out. They're like, no, we're bringing you in as a manager. We're expecting you to be already in that role and kind of figured out your style and how you do things coming into the role. So learning from an existing company, you get that. But it's interesting, Dan, you mentioned kind of pulled into something, because I mean that was my career path as well, where I got into management. I could never get at that point I couldn't get a team that could do what I could do, and so I got pulled into these pieces.
Do both.
I didn't find a way out. So interesting that when you're talking about land.com, and we're not blasting any company or anything like that, but how what do you think it would have taken, or at the end did you find a way to become much more of an only manager before you moved to Envision? What would have taken early on to be able to move into a pure management role?
It probably would have taken some investment by the company to bring on more people. I ended up being a bit of a crutch in some instances where, we don't need to hire anybody else, because if push comes to shove, Dan can jump in and fix it. Versus if I said, you know what, I can't. I have these other responsibilities that are equally or more important. So that's going to have to wait. And some of that was my inability to push back. Some of that was, I think, a lack of mentorship for myself about how to push back in a healthy way. And so, like I said, I just had to kind of figure it out on my own and trial and error, and like telling myself, like, the next time this happens, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to approach it in this way and say, actually, I can't afford to do that because I have these other responsibilities. So if you want me to do that, I'm not going to be able to do this, which you already asked me to take care of. And engineers have to do that all the time, right? You gave me this new user story, but I still have this other one that I haven't finished yet. Which one do you want me to do? And oftentimes I think as a manager, you feel like you have to do all of the things, but I have tried to start to approach that as I still have priorities, and not everything can be a number one priority. So I will routinely with my boss go, I've got 12 things to do and I don't know what I should be doing. Can you tell me what you're most three most important things are so I can just focus on those. And he's really good about going, yep, here's your three things. If you get these three things done, I'll be happy. The other 9 can wait till next week. Like, the problems are going to be there. They're not going to go away. There's a never ending pipeline of work. And so Stephen will tell me straight up, like, here's the 3 things you need to do. And he does the same thing with our CEO. Like, there's this constant kind of, as a manager, it just becomes a little bit more difficult for you to figure out what your priorities are. So you have to have someone you can lean on to kind of help you level set.
If I can just put a spotlight on something you said there, because I think this is so broadly applicable, which is there is a tremendous amount of power always in taking the implicit and making it explicit so that everybody understands what's going on. And also nobody can sort of shirk the responsibility of having understood what was going on. And in the case that Dan's talking about, where he's saying, I have, 6 things that I need to do, and you're telling me that I have to do these other 3 things. Well, which of these 6 things should I not do in order to make your things a priority? And by putting that out in the open, it really forces everyone to get on the same page about what the roadmap looks like and what is prioritized. And they can't look back and say, oh, well, why didn't you get these other things done? That was like that, that's your responsibility.
Yeah, exactly.
Making explicit.
Well, it's really easy to assume that everybody else knows what's on your plate.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's really easy to assume that your team lead looked at all of your other user stories before he gave you that one, and knows everything that you're working on, and knows the 3 shadow work things that you're working on. And if you assume that they know everything that you're working on and they just decided to give you another thing, then that leads to a sense of like you're not being appreciated or you're being taken advantage of, instead of just saying, sure, I'd love to do that, but I'm going to have to drop one of these other things. So which ones do you want me to drop? And if you always approach it with that yes and type of improv mentality, yes, I'd love to do that. And what would you like me to not do? Then that helps the person giving you that work understand that there's a trade-off that they may not have realized. And it's really easy to just assume that everybody knew what was on your plate. And so I'm really careful to make sure that people really understand that, like, yeah, I've got a lot going on. So, like, tell me which thing is going to fail.
And just to cross-pollinate here, because this is so important, I think, in all aspects of life, and to take this outside of the technology world altogether, and to share a personal story here. I will get into bed with my wife, and we will turn on the TV, and she'll say, there's nothing to watch. And in my head, I'm like, whoa, we have 6 shows that we're watching right now. So are you saying that you don't want to continue watching any of those shows? Because in my mind, I'm like, well, obviously we're all on the same page. But in her mind, she's like, I have a terrible memory. I never remember what we're watching. So it just doesn't occur to me that there's 6 shows that we're watching. So if you can just, instead of me in my mind making up this whole story, like, oh, she doesn't want to watch these shows anymore, I'll have to find a time to watch those on my own because I was actually really enjoying them. If I just had said, hey, so do you not want to watch X, Y, and Z? And if you don't want, I'll do that on my own. We can find something else. But if I say that out loud, she'll always go, oh, no, I totally forgot we're watching that. Yeah, let's watch that.
Yeah, it's that implicit versus explicit. It's that typical meme where there's like the 2 people laying in bed with their backs facing each other, and she's thinking all of the things he's thinking, and he's like, I would love to speak with him.
Oh my God. It's a quick aside. I saw this hilarious little video short the other day where it's like this mock news story about this boyfriend who ruined the romantic weekend that they were having because he actually said what was on his mind. And the woman's like, we're having such a romantic day. And I asked him what he was thinking. And I was hoping he would say something like, this would be a great place to bring our kids one day, or everything I'll ever need, I have right here. And the newscaster is like, well, what did you say? He goes, I said, pigs are really a lot bigger than you expect them to be.
Yes, those lessons definitely do translate from personal life to professional life. And I think that oftentimes it's very hard for people to feel like they can speak up and say really what's on their mind and be radically candid about what's going on and what the trade-offs are and what the challenges are. And the more you can do that, especially if you have leadership that respects that. Sometimes, frankly, you can't. Sometimes your leadership isn't good. Sometimes your leadership doesn't want to hear those things, and they just say, well, suck it up and move on and get it done. But that's when frankly, that's when you start working on your resume and holding some mock interviews with some friends or something, and figuring out a better place to be so that you can feel supported and know that you're not going to get abused by your leadership.
Dan, I got a quick comment and then a follow-up question on something. The
Sure.
comment I have is for all those in the cold fusion space. If you don't know for all those not in the cold fusion space, what if you want to become a manager? My takeaway from what Dan said is try and push cold fusion into a company, because then you can't write the code, and therefore you can become a better manager.
Nailed it.
There you go.
That is our key takeaway for all of those non-cold fusion people. Is to bring them into companies, because you become a better manager. But that takeaway aside, your journey, your 2 years or 3 years as you transition to that manager, for those listening and watching, what are some of the things that where did you turn to get tools to learn how to be a manager? Was it all trial and error? Were there good books on it? Were there podcasts? What did you look at?
Yeah, good question. A lot of it was trial and error. A lot of it was doing a really bad job at being either of those things, manager or IC, because I couldn't do either of them well, since neither of them had my full focus. But a lot of it did end up being podcasts, oftentimes somewhat unrelated to management and more related to just people in general. Like Daniel Pink has a good book about how to motivate people. And I can't remember the name of the book right now, which is mildly embarrassing. But like intrinsic motivation versus explicit motivation. It's kind of the opposite of the whole implicit versus explicit when you're talking about expectations. People want to feel like they have a reason for doing what they're doing versus just, if you do this, I'll give you $5. Right, especially in creative endeavors.
Do you ever watch Simon Sinek?
Yes. Yeah. He talks about the same type of things, like explicit motivation. Like, if you do this, I'll give you $100. For creative endeavors, doesn't motivate people. It will motivate people to do rote tasks. Like, if you can hammer 10 nails in this amount of time, I'll give you $100. Great. But if you need to do creative problem solving, that can actually hamper your ability to think creatively, because you feel like you've got this pressure on top of you. Versus if you do this for this intrinsic reason, because you're going to enjoy it, or you're going to make the world a better place, or you're going to have some positive outcome, it's a whole lot easier to get the creative juices flowing. So those types of books, because I never realized that's what motivated me. Like, my bonus structure at work doesn't really motivate me, right? What motivates me is helping people do their best work. And making sure that my team is well supported. And that took me a long time to realize that that's kind of what motivates me to be a manager versus what motivated me to be an IC. And so Daniel Pink, Simon Sinek, there's a book from called Turn the Ship Around, which is about kind of the leader mentality.
We had to read that in Vision.
Yeah, it's a really, really good book, and it informed my approach to how I empower teams. And so I've got a whole series of books here on the shelf about, management styles, candor, how to have conversations with people, especially like for engineers. There's a cliche, because it's mostly true, is that a lot of engineers are very introverted. I am not an extrovert, regardless of the fact that I have my face on this podcast. I do not like talking to people in general.
Yeah.
I'm extremely introverted. My wife asked me yesterday, like, if you could go to a library or a party, where would you? The library. You don't even need to finish the sentence. I'd go to the library. It's oftentimes difficult as an introvert, when you're not used to talking to people, figuring out how to do that in a comfortable way, and how to feel like you're not an imposter, because it's not a natural thing to do. The days where I have 3 or 4 one-on-ones with my team, at the end of the day, I'm completely exhausted. I feel good about the work that I did, but I'm exhausted, because I'm like, I have to put myself out there. I have to be the person that my team needs in order to be a manager. And so those were things that took me a long time to learn through trial and error and practice. And doing it and being uncomfortable. Just like you have to practice when you're learning a new technology. You have to get in there and you have to do it. You have to make mistakes, and you have to get comments on your PR that says that's a horrible idea. You need to do it this way instead. Like you have to do the same thing from a management perspective. It's just sometimes you don't hear that you did a bad job until much later when someone comes to you and says, hey, that thing you said to me was kind of upsetting, or I disagree with your approach to this particular thing. And so it can oftentimes be a little bit more painful when you do it wrong.
If I could just do a little cross-pollination for a second, because you had mentioned Simon Sinek, Ryan. Simon Sinek has his own podcast called A Bit of Optimism, which is very good. And I just recently listened to an episode where he interviewed Will Guidara about a book called Unreasonable Hospitality, which isn't about management per se, but is about the hospitality business, which is kind of a broad umbrella term that touches a lot of things and I think is relevant. But also another podcast I listened to is called Soft Skills Engineering. And it's basically just a call-in show where people ask questions about work, and they always talk about it from a soft skills perspective, an interpersonal perspective. It's also just a very entertaining show.
Good one.
But let me ask a question here, because you work remotely now. I work remotely now. Earlier in your career, did you work in an office, or have you been remote for just a long time?
I've been fully remote since I guess the start of the pandemic, really, early 2020. We went fully remote. I had worked remote before in bits and pieces or hybrid situations, but went fully remote in 2020.
So let me ask you this, because there's a small swing now back to working in office between Amazon and a couple of, Salesforce, I think, and a couple of companies. And one of the big things that they always talk about is on the engineering side, all of the impromptu conversations that people have in the hallway and around the water cooler and getting lunch together, et cetera. But I'm wondering, because we talked about the power of making things that are implicit, explicit. And as a manager, I'm sure you often have to pull information out of people. Engineers are introverted. They don't necessarily want to be so forthcoming with the things that bother them. I personally find that when I'm in a meeting on a Zoom call, I feel more at ease being open and vulnerable, because I feel like I can just look off to the side and I'm not actually even in the room with the person I'm talking to. Do you find that the digital aspect of management is easier or harder or the same as being in office? What's your perspective?
That's a good question. I think it's easier for me for much the same reason. There's some separation. So when I was at CoStar, I worked in downtown Austin. I had an office that had all glass walls. And so
why did Dan make that person cry?
How do I have a hard conversation with somebody when they then have to walk right out the door and walk into the cubicle farm with the team? How do I have a hard conversation with my boss and then sit there in my glass-sided office and try and keep my composure? As an introvert, as I consider myself pretty emotional and empathetic and sympathetic, and so being remote gives me the opportunity to click end call and deal with my own self in a private situation. To your point, I think it probably is easier for me to have conversations with people digitally for that reason. I think it also means that I can just join when I'm ready, and then we can end the call when we're ready. And I feel like in person, you have all these kind of implicit social contract, oh, well, you need to come in the room and we shake hands and say, hey, how you doing? And those kind of things. And you do that on Zoom calls, sure. Mm-hmm. But then when you wrap up the conversation, it's okay, well, I guess we're done now. But I'm not ready to leave the office, or they're not ready to get up because they're not feeling good about the conversation. And it's a little bit easier to kind of start and end things and feel like you can kind of adjust and recalibrate before the next conversation. I think that a lot of the return to office stuff is good for some and just bad for others. I literally left CoStar because they were pushing us to go back to the office. I'm no, I love working remote. I love my 30-second commute instead of my hour-and-a-half commute. And so I made a job change for that reason. I probably would have stayed at CoStar for another 10 years, just coasting if they hadn't pushed me back. to return to the office, but it made me realize that, I don't actually enjoy what I'm doing. I'm just kind of helping people sell dirt and, rural real estate. And like, I'm not getting a whole lot of enjoyment out of it. And I interviewed at Envision like 3 or 4 times over the course of 10 years before I finally tricked him into hiring me. And I really enjoyed my time there. And then the contacts that I made helped me get the job at Virtuous. And now I feel like I'm doing much, much more impactful work. And so it was a good change for me.
Nice.
It's interesting you talk about the introvert and the extrovert, because Ben and I have talked about this before when we go into conferences, that he's an introvert, so he kind of recharges during the break, during the each session.
Yeah,
that's when he recharges, and I'm the extrovert where I recharge when everyone comes out of the sessions.
Yeah,
and it's interesting that you also tell the story about how you left a company because they were going to force you to come back into the office, and I actually left a company because they're going to make me go home. Because I'm like, I don't want to be fully remote. Yeah. I'm going somewhere else that has an office I can go to. So it's very funny on that one. But and a follow up on that, I mean, so you mentioned as an introvert how you are exhausted after your 4 one-on-ones. How do you recharge? Because you may not have those ability to. You're not at a conference. You can't sit into a session and be by yourself. So how do you recharge when really your job is to deal with people all the time?
Great question.
My wife and I are homebodies. We don't go anywhere or see anybody if we don't have to. And so in the evenings, I hang out with my wife. We go out to dinner somewhere or we cook something at home. I'll sit on the couch and read a book, escape into, some sort of escapism, get into a fantasy or sci-fi book. I'll do some woodworking around the house. Like I mentioned earlier, like as an IC, you can go, hey, look what I made. Oftentimes as a manager, you need to find new ways to scratch that creative itch. So I'll go into the garage and do some woodworking project, or my wife and I will work on, remodeling the closet or those types of things. But I spend time with people I care about, and I work on house projects and do that kind of thing and just kind of get away from the computer. I find that, I hate to say the older I get, but the older I get, the more I tend to disconnect as soon as I'm finished with work. Turn the computer off, put my phone on Do Not Disturb, completely disconnect from all of the notifications around the news and the world and people who are kind of demanding my attention, and just focus on the things I'm interested in. And so that's how I recharge at the end of the day. And I feel like I have my calendar here in front of me. Like Tuesday, I had 7 straight hours of meetings. And so at the end of the day, and they were super productive. We got a lot done. But at the end of the day, I'm like, I just need to sit. And my wife's like, what'd you do today? I'm like, I don't know. Like, I just need to read a book. Maybe we could talk in an hour or so after I had a chance to decompress and get my head on straight and be able to tell you the important parts of the day instead of recap 7 hours of meetings. But we made this good decision. We made an offer to someone who's accepted. A lot of good stuff happened. But at the end of the day, I'm just like, I need a break.
So it sounds like in pulling from some other comments you've made and from some of the books and stuff you mentioned, that having that why inside of you of why you're doing something helps an introvert get through that day. So for those listening, Absolutely. The audience out there, if you're struggling with that and you're finding yourself where you're end of the day and you don't have the energy and you're not excited about that, then maybe it's you find that company where you do believe their why and you want and that gets you through the day, and you're like, look, I'm energized because of the work I'm doing. Even if it's not even not an IC type of thing, individual contributor, I believe in this vision enough that I'm going to get through it. I'm going to be exhausted at the end of the day, but it's like anybody on an athletic team. You're doing the practices. You're in football. You're like, okay, I remember high school football. I'm like, I hate this end of 2-a-days in the summer. But I'm like, you know what?
You enjoy the result.
Yeah, there's a regional championship at the end if we do this well. So I get the vision of our team and where we're going with this. So I'm gonna be exhausted physically at the end of this day because of that future vision.
And I feel like that's the most important thing you can do as a leader is make sure that your team understands the why. And not just the company why, but their own personal why. Like, why do you do this? Why do you show up every day? And how can I make sure that I understand each individual employee's why? Because that's what motivates them. That's what I need to lean into when I'm having a conversation with them. One employee literally might just be there to cash a paycheck, and that's totally fine if they're doing the job, they're being productive, they're putting out good quality work. But I know that for them, I need to protect the work-life balance and I need to not ask more than they're willing to give because, again, they're just there for the paycheck. Someone else may be deeply, deeply invested in the company mission, and they may be willing to work 70 hours a week in order to get things done. And then I have to say, but I can't have you doing that because you're going to burn yourself out and then I'm going to lose you. And then I've lost my investment in you because you pushed yourself too hard. And so knowing every single individual's why and trying to get to know all of your employees in that way is super, super important because they all have a different reason for doing things. And I find that that's probably one of the most interesting things about being a leader is C# works the way C# works. Right? A lot of it is black and white. And you can find interesting and novel ways to solve problems, but the code doesn't really argue with you. If you made a mistake, it's because you made a mistake, not because the code decided that it didn't like the way you asked it to do the job. Right? But as a manager, most of the time, some you never know. But with people, if you ask someone to do the job in a way that doesn't resonate with them or is completely dissonant with their own personal motivations, then you will actually get far less productivity out of that person. So you have to know how to motivate them and you have to become a student of people, which is frankly why I don't think you can be a good IC and a good manager at the same time because they require so completely different focuses. And you have to be kind of fully focused on your people and fully focused on what motivates each of those individuals in order to be able to be an effective leader.
If I can just shine a spotlight on something you said there, because I think if we have engineers listening and they're management curious, they might come up with a plan, but they're like, oh, well, I want to try management. So let me see if I can find a position, even within my own company, where I'm like developing half the time and managing half the time. I think what we're saying kind of in the totality of our conversation here is that's just not the recipe for success. You're not going to have your foot in both ponds. You really have to either do one or the other in order to get good at either. And being hesitant is not going to give you a sense of what's possible.
I think if you are management curious, the best thing you can do is try and get yourself into a technical lead position where you can still do the IC work, but you can also spend some time doing the mentorship side of things. Because oftentimes that's what a technical team lead does is like, oh, I saw you committed this PR and you implemented this in an inefficient way. Here's a better way to do it. How do you have those mentorship conversations with a more junior engineer?
Yeah.
How do you bring up somebody and help motivate them in order to produce their best work from a technical perspective? And then you can still maintain that IC, like I'm going to write code 70% of the time and I'm going to mentor the rest of my team 30% of the time. Versus if I tried to be that technical manager, which I think is a horrible job title and it's a horrible job to have because you can't be either of those things in totality. You're always doing half of one or the other, unless you some wonder child who can do both. I could not, and I haven't ever seen anybody be able to do it well. So yeah, and conversely, if you're not interested in the management role, you need to find a company that can support that direction too, because there's two separate career paths, manager or IC. And oftentimes engineers think they have to be a manager in order to move up in their career. Like, oh, I'm a senior engineer, the next step is being a manager. Or I'm a staff engineer, the next step is being a manager. Almost my entire career, every person I've ever talked to that talks about moving up, talks about moving into management. And I don't think that's a good idea. If you're not interested in management, don't think about it, but find a company who believes that there are equal career tracks for ICs and managers. If you could be a engineering manager, you could be a staff engineer. If you could be a director of engineering, you could be a senior staff engineer. If you could be a VP of engineering, you could be a principal engineer. There ought to be equal levels on the IC and management track, and you need to find a company who can support that type of growth if you're simply not interested in being a manager, because there's not the right choice for everybody, and companies should support that type of career path for people. We do at Virtuous. I've had people throughout my career move into management and then move right back out. It's like I decided it was a bad idea. I didn't enjoy it, and like I want to go back to being an IC. Okay, that's fine. Do what you love. Because if you don't, and I continue to force you to be in this role, you're going to go find someplace else. And then once again, I've lost all of my investment in that individual. All the information that they take with them, all the context, all goes away, and I got to start over.
Ben, I got a question for you, because we've been talking a lot here with Dan about how his career path moved him into management. And I'm sure you've had options throughout your career to be pulled into that.
Yeah.
And you stayed the individual contributor. What made you resist it? And kind of what Dan was saying about having a company stand behind you is not trying to promote you into something that you didn't want to do. How has that worked out for you? Or how did that come about? And how were you able to kind of be strong and say, no, I want to be an IC. This is where I get my enjoyment and my energy.
I don't know if I'd position it as being strong. It was more like, I think if anything, I almost fell into the trap that we were talking about, where I imagined that there was some role where I could be IC half the time because that was my happy place, and then management the other half of the time. And I think what I found, which is probably what a lot of people find, is that 1, doing anything new is hard. 2, managing people is also just naturally very hard. So when you're doing these things and it is challenging, the natural reaction is to want to retreat into a place where you can feel satisfied, where you can feel like you're winning. And for me, that was always retreating back into the IC part of this sort of hybrid role. And it just became very clear to me that as far as adding value to the company, this is how I always positioned it. The most value that I can add is in the individual contributor track. Now, if I had taken the leap and went full time on the management side, I like to believe, like Dan said, I feel very empathic. Dan says he feels very empathic. I do feel like I'm a good read of people and I want people to succeed. And if I had truly committed to it, I like to believe that I could have actually done a very good job. I think I could have taken all of the driven learning mindset that I bring to engineering and I could have brought it to people management. I really just never put myself in the uncomfortable position of having no choice.
That's a good way of putting it. Because I find I did the same thing whenever I first became a manager, is I kept retreating to that happy place of code.
Yeah.
Like I can have a performance conversation and then I'm going to go bury myself in like 3 hours of SQL index tuning and squeezing an extra 2 milliseconds out of the query and like doing all that kind of deep technical work because I got enjoyment from that and I got to see something done at the end of that process. And yeah, it took me a while to realize I was actually getting enjoyment out of the performance conversations and the personal growth conversations and the what do you want to be when you grow up conversations. Right. And it just took me a long time to realize that I actually enjoyed that. And because I kept finding ways to escape from what I believed was something I was not good at, because I wasn't. I was a crap manager when I first started. Everybody's a crap programmer when they first start. Like, you pick up a new language, you don't know what you're doing.
Yes, we've totally grown out of
you
that.
You don't know what you're doing. If only. It's like you said, everything is a learning opportunity, and every time you jump into something new, you have to learn a new set of skills that you didn't have before in order to figure out how to do it well. And management skills, there's no manual to go to. I can't go read the documentation about how to be a good manager like I can go read the documentation about how to properly implement an ORM, right? Like you can't go read the API docs on how to have a performance conversation.
Yep.
And so you need to find mentors, you need to find online resources, you need to find books you can read that will kind of help teach you how to address some of those things, and then how to keep yourself healthy in the process, because it can be super emotional, right? Letting somebody go that you tried really hard to save is a super, super hard thing. I had to to do that a few months back, and it was just deeply, deeply painful. But figuring out how to handle that and deal with it with compassion and do the things that you need to do in order to have those kind of performance conversations and care for people in the right way, it takes a long time to learn.
Yeah, I was put my first ever management job. I was put in the awkward situation where there were two of us going for the position, and if I got it, we didn't necessarily need her IC or this person's IC role at the company because I would be straddling both. It wasn't big enough where there was not enough people underneath of me that required full-time management. Yeah. And so my first day on the job was to let the person go who did not get the job.
Oh, that's brutal.
That's a bad way to get into management.
I was nervous as can be. I mean, I'm like, sweating. I'm like, I don't know what's going to happen into this conversation. Like, I got in early and I'm like watching the window. I'm like, okay, this person's coming in the door.
Yeah.
It was rough. It's
a different set of highs and lows. Like you have highs and lows in engineering, like, oh, we had a production issue and it turns out it's my fault. I left a semicolon off of a line and brought all the production down. And like, there's problems there. There's anxiety there, but you correct it. And the same thing on the management side. It's just, I feel like the highs and lows can oftentimes be far larger. Like I had to help manage one of the layoffs at Envision where it was shutting down. That was one of the hardest days of my professional career, having like 30 separation conversations in a day. And like, but conversely, hiring new people is just such a joy. Seeing them on their first day. We have 2 new employees starting at Virtuous, and they're going to start the day before our all-team kickoff. And so we're going to get to see them all in person on their first day at work. And like, that's going to be a great day, bringing new people into the fold and meeting new people and helping kickstart somebody else's career in a new direction. So the highs and lows there's a big swing. And so if you enjoy that and you're up for that, then management's a great way to go. If you feel like that's going to be too emotionally draining, or frankly, you feel like you can't be empathetic to someone who you're, having a separation conversation with, then management is probably not the right spot for you. But it's a personal choice everybody's got to figure out.
I'm having some feelings, and I don't think I have a question in here, but if you'll cut me some latitude, let me just stream of consciousness for a second, and maybe there'll be something interesting in there. So there's a couple of parallel thoughts that I'm having. One, we talked about this idea that for a long time, engineers, the common sentiment was that you work up to becoming management. That was just the track. We also talked about this idea of at the end of the day, especially as you're getting older, and I feel this very much myself, I just want to disconnect. I don't want to continue to do work, after the bell rings, kind of, so to speak. And I think there is kind of the sentiment that, or this feeling in the ether that the engineering world is just very fast paced. It's very chaotic. Things are changing all the time. As we talk often about framework fatigue and JavaScript fatigue. And again, this is all just stream of consciousness here. Maybe it'll go somewhere. I think it might be easy for people to think that engineering is a young person's game, and that you have the energy to try all these different things, and that as you get older, that's just exhausting, and maybe management feels like the right track. I am happy to say that in the last couple of years, especially, I have heard many more podcasts talk about this idea of having parallel tracks of individual contributorship that are equal to the management tracks. That feels like it is emerging as something that is being discussed more frequently. All right, I'm gonna round this thought out in a second here. If I'm reflecting on my own reflections, one thing that I feel like I enjoyed when I was younger was the chaos. jQuery just released a new version. Let me drop everything I'm doing and look at jQuery, right? Yeah. Like, Firefox just released some new support for a CSS property. Let me go look at that. Or, I used to say, the moment a Cold Fusion beta would drop, literally that was my world for the next 3 weeks, right? And as an adult, as an older adult now, Cold Fusion 2025 beta has dropped. I've like barely looked at it at all. And it's not because I'm not interested in it. It's just that my priorities are different. And okay, I'm rounding this out, I promise. I think as I've gotten older, the thing that excites me is no longer the kind of chaos of learning something new constantly. The thing that excites me is building a successful product and building a successful team and building a successful company. And I think it's easy to think that that means you can't be in engineering anymore, that feels like maybe more of a management track. But I think it's important, maybe I'm just talking to myself here. It's important for me to accept the fact that being less excited about the changing landscape isn't a detraction. It's not a demerit against my engineering street cred. I think it's more of a point towards a more holistic thinking about engineering and about what the ultimate value add and the ultimate goal of engineering is, which is to build a product that delivers value to the customers. Yep. And I'm just trying to, like come to grips with all of my feelings and how that lays up against the landscape and against the zeitgeist. And sorry, there's no question here.
I think the further you get along in your career, the more you focus on refinement of your existing skills. Right. You focus on getting better at what you do instead of just learning the next hot thing that's shown up, because you also realize that, well, I've learned 47 frameworks that are no longer in production.
Right.
They're no longer maintained.
Right. How valuable was that?
This new thing with some goofy name is just another flash in the pan, and it'll be gone before you know it. And if it's not, then I'll learn it. But right. I used to be in that mode where I'm like, I'm going to learn every new thing that comes along. And then like 2 years later, that's completely irrelevant. Should I have spent my time learning that? Or should I have spent my time getting better at software, getting right. better at architecture, getting better at the planning and the refinement and the product focus and all the things that really make a good engineer a good engineer? I'll tell you, I've ignored many resumes that are just a laundry list of frameworks and technologies that someone has worked with. That doesn't tell me anything. If you read my post on LinkedIn, you'll see me say things like, tell me what you accomplished, not what you did. Because those are two different things. One is output, one is outcome. I don't care what you put out. Like, what was the outcome of that? What benefit did it have? How did you improve things? How did you improve your team? How did you improve your product? How did you improve your customers' lives? What performance improvements were you able to make? Not just, I worked with C# and Entity Framework and I did this, that. And I'm like, yeah, that's what you're supposed to do. That's your job as an engineer. But tell me how you were able to actually bring something new to the table. And those are the types of resumes that I look at as a hiring manager, because technology comes and goes, frameworks come and go, the next new thing shows up, and yeah, if you're constantly chasing that, you'll never reach the finish line. And I find that the most senior engineers that I've worked with oftentimes are exactly that same way. Like, oh yeah, I'll look at it in like 6 months if it's still around. Yeah, and just focus on getting better at your craft instead of focusing on new tools.
Right.
Like, so some of the best woodworkers I've seen use 200-year-old chisels. Right. They're not going out and buying the next fancy tool in order to do quality work. They're just using the right tool for the job and refining and getting better and becoming better at their craft and better craftsmen than they are just searching for the next new tool to try and make their job easier.
Yeah. On that note, how is Virtuous Software integrating AI?
Hey, I was going to that one too.
I'm joking. On a serious note, though, and I think just to reflect on reflections.
Yeah.
As an engineer, there's a blanket statement here. If the new drop of a framework or the new release of a database is not exciting to you, that is not necessarily a sign that, oh, maybe I'm done with engineering and I should move into management. It is literally just a sign that you are becoming more mature in the way you think about product development. And I think like, again, like taking the implicit and making it explicit, people might not be aware that they're having feelings like that, and making it explicit and saying it's fine and saying it's a good sign even, I think is powerful.
Yeah. And it's really easy to just quickly go to the next new shiny thing, and the next new shiny thing may not be stable yet. Maybe you shouldn't be putting that in production. And yeah, having a more kind of responsible view towards that, I think is super important. But go ahead, Ryan.
I know we're getting towards the end here, but Ben mentioned AI, and I did have a question about that. But on the soft side of it, with AI being pushed more towards developers, what kind of anxiety is going through your team's head right now around AI and their jobs, and what's going to be taken over by AI, or are they going to be replaced by someone else who can prompt engineer better than them?
Zero. That is not a concern within my team, as far as I know, because machines can't make decisions the way people do. Machines aren't sitting in the requirements gathering meetings. The AI isn't sitting in the customer interviews to understand how people use something. You can sure give it a good prompt and it may solve some algorithmic problem, but computers aren't good at solving people problems. And in my particular perspective, software is a people problem. Who uses your software? People. Unless you're just building APIs for machines to talk to machines, but you're still building an API for people to interact with. You're building a UI for people to interact with. Like, I've always seen software as a people problem, and anyone who sees it as simply just bits and computer problems, I think, is missing the forest for the trees, because your ultimate customer is a person. Go for it, Dan.
I feel like no. I along these lines, because I'm grappling with all the AI stuff as well, and I feel half the time I feel like it's revolutionary, half the time I feel like I'm being gaslit.
Yes,
but one of the things that strikes me as the craziest statement is when I see people say things like, "Oh, AI is going to 100% replace product management." Because you could just ask ChatGPT for a product plan and it'll give it to you. And I'm like, what? To your point, like, product management is the most people-y of all the jobs. Like, literally your whole job is dealing with people.
Yes, absolutely.
That's the safest possible job.
Yes. I will say, joke around that I went into management because I couldn't automate myself out of being a manager.
Yeah.
I will say that AI is getting better at some of that. I use it a ton. Like, I showed someone my Chat GPT screen, and I'm like, yeah, here's my yesterday, the 8 or 9 chat sessions I had with it. And I'm not using it to replace people, but what I will do is I will give it a persona, and I will say, hey, look, I want you to be part of our target audience is developers. So I'm like, hey, you're a developer. And I give it some criteria about who you are, and I say, hey, look at our web page, because I'm marketing side of Xbyte Cloud, and I say, look at this page. Tell me what your feelings are about this page. What do you like about it? What do you not like about it? What stands out as you as the primary messages in that persona? And I'll switch that out, and I'll plug in a different persona, and I'll have them giving an output, and it's completely different.
Yeah.
So I do see it. I've never seen it replaces it, because there's too many nuances that it doesn't get.
Right. It's a good tool.
But I found that the brainstorming aspect of things, it's great. And even I think a twist to it that I saw somewhere that I'm starting to do more of is where I will have it try and prompt me. So it's okay, instead of me requiring you to be the person who has to have all this knowledge. I have tons of context in my head. Help ask me questions to help me come up with a great way to do something. And it's posed different ways. I didn't think of, like, I equate it to, and no offense to my wife at all, but she doesn't know my job and more than I've told her about it, or technical pieces of it. So she's a great sounding board, because she'll ask that question I didn't think of, that's obvious to her, because she's got context around the world and didn't have the blinders on. So I that's what kind of sometimes I equate to the ChatGPT is, okay, just that person next to you that you can talk to, it may help you find the answer inside of you, or ask that question, or find something angle that you're just not seeing right now.
Yeah, I think AI is a great tool and a great way to give you a kickstart to things or to validate assumptions. But I have a hard time fathoming a world where I'm just going to be able to give ChatGPT a prompt, and it's going to go build an application for me, or it's going to solve some complex situation for me with, all the context that someone needs in order to be able to solve big problems inside of a large application. Like, the Virtuous CRM is massive. There's like 2 people in the company that have a good sense of all of the areas of the application. So there's no possible way for me to give all of the context that a machine would need to know in order to solve those types of problems. At least I don't think there is. But I'm no AI expert, but I feel like it's oftentimes a hammer looking for a nail. People are like, oh, I have this new tool. What can I hit with it? And how can I use it? And so to jokingly answer your question from earlier, Ben, we're starting to play with some AI just in ways that try to make people's jobs easier.
Yeah.
Trying to find ways where we can make it easier to write queries or make it easier to get questions about how a particular part of the application works. Low-hanging fruit that can actually help people get their jobs done. But my engineers, as far as I know, aren't afraid of losing their jobs to a computer yet, because we do spend so much time collaborating with each other and trying to find ways to solve the right problems for our customers, which I don't think an AI would yet understand.
Right.
No.
I feel like my biggest fear is not losing my job to AI. It's losing my job to an executive leadership team that believes that AI can replace the engineer. Like that's the
Yes.
fear.
There you go. That's a good one. Yep.
This makes me think of, I don't know why this is like not quite on target, but it just popped in my head years and years ago. I think in like 1985 or something, there was a Matthew Broderick movie called Project X, where he's training monkeys to do flight simulations so that they can understand how humans will behave if they have to fly into a nuclear war zone. And at the pinnacle of the movie, spoiler alert here, he doesn't want to keep killing these monkeys in these nuclear radiation tests. And his excuse to the generals at the end is like, it's not going to teach us anything about humans because a monkey doesn't know he's dying, but a human pilot will know that he's dying. So we can't really extrapolate any of this. And that's how I feel. Like there's just so much weight to how people interact that this idea that we can be so easily replaced is sad.
I think from a management perspective, to circle back on that, I think Dan touched on this. A great point is from or one of you guys is, if you're a manager, don't be cognizant of the potential fear that Ben said that your team may be fearful of an executive team's going to come in and think that AI can take over people's roles.
Yeah.
So know that and be careful as you're talking about. If you are a management team who does believe in AI, just be careful of the impact you may have on your people by overemphasizing it, or making it seem like it can take over their jobs. Make sure that they realize it's a tool that they can use to help them, as opposed to kind of take over.
Yeah, like we use GitHub's Copilot, and we always have conversations around how can we use this to actually elevate the work that our team is doing, not replace the work that our team is doing. How can we make your job easier by using these new tools in order to take care of some of the grunt work, like point the AI at a method in your code and have it write the unit tests for you. Validate those tests afterwards, right? But write out some assumptions, give it a little bit of acceptance criteria, and have it do the low-hanging fruit for you and validate it. But I don't think I'm at a point in my career, and I don't think AI is at a point where I would trust it to write mission-critical payment processing code for $1 billion worth of transactions. I'm not there yet.
Right.
It's funny. Ben and I just had another podcast with somebody, and they were talking about that exact same thing is unit tests and testing, is because no one likes doing that. So you know what? It's not having AI write code. So you don't want AI to write code so you can create new unit tests. Just like you don't want AI to be creative so you can do more laundry. You want it to do your laundry so you can be more creative.
Yes.
So we'll leave it on that. So the AI making life more positive, as opposed to kind of replacing people. So you don't have to do the grunt stuff.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Enjoy the conversation. Thank you very much.
Any last words you want to leave with any people that you give great advice to kind of say, hey, start off with a team lead, see if motivation motivates you, and then kind of grow from there. Look for people, look for a company that you believe in their why, grow from there. Look for someone who will support you being a peer manager, if that's the direction you want to go to. Read the books, the podcasts around it. Any other good advice that you want to leave with our audience?
I think the big one is just And I know it sometimes sounds cliche, like follow what makes you happy. Do what you're enjoying doing, because you will get better at it. If you pick a path that you feel is going to elevate your career, but you don't enjoy it, then you won't do a good job at it, or you won't do your best job at it. So yeah, just follow your joy, as it were. Make sure you're doing the things that bring you happiness, and then study and get better at it. Become an expert at people, become an expert at motivation and finding the why, and helping people find their own motivation. And that's the best you can do, is books, podcasts, follow thought leaders on LinkedIn or wherever, and just continue to learn and grow the same way you would if you were learning a new framework or the latest release of Cold Fusion. People treat people management as if it's static, and to a great degree, people as a race, we don't change very quickly. But there's always something new to learn. There's always a new person with a new quirk that you've never dealt with before. And like figuring out how to motivate that person is a challenge in and of itself. And so just stay curious and keep learning, and you'll be successful regardless of which path you choose.
Fabulous.
Dan, you've been amazing. I think super valuable to everybody out there, regardless of where they are in their career. Some pieces that you can learn from this. Ben, you've been amazing as always. I'll be your Jerry to my Ben. His family's ice cream. So everyone, thank you for joining us this week. Stay tuned for more live events as we do those. And as I've stolen from Ben his ending, everybody, cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you guys.
Cheers. Thank you.